Shereen was one of the finest academic I've ever met. Wonderful scholar, an inspiring teacher, a prolific writer, an amazing editor, and a committed public intellectual. I was never her student, but I was for 26 years a colleague of hers, and over 10 years we co-edited the journal Studies in History. As a colleague, as a professor, as a teacher, she was always present in the faculty meetings, never voluble, but on all important issues, she expressed her ideas firmly, categorically, and clearly. Very often, these are the ideas that disturbed many faculty members within. But she was always honest with her ideas. As a co-editor, it was always pleasure. It was a great pleasure to work with her. She was always editing the journal very, very meticulously along with me. And I cannot forget that year when I was going on sabbatical and I was worrying about the journal. And she came to my room and said, "Neeladri, stop worrying, stop fretting, just go on your sabbatical, I'll look after the journal." And she looked after the journal with great efficiency and punctuality, something I could never match. I was never punctual in submitting the manuscript to the press. I'm a modernist, but I followed her writings with great interest because many of the themes that she was interested in resonated with the ideas that I was interested in. Her central research, as has already been talked of, was Mesopotamia and India and the trade relations between India and Mesopotamia. But over the years, she became passionately interested in pastoralism, on tribal cultures and society, on the history of marginals, on artisans, on craftsmen and others. And it is this history of pastoralism which in particular tied my own interest to that of hers. And I would like to say a bit about the way her interest in pastoralism develops and the way I see a transition in her own ideas about pastoralism and how it deepens over time, and how, in fact, I feel that her studies on pastoralism deepened her arguments about Mesopotamia, about Harappan culture, society over time. The difference between her first book and Understanding Harappa, which Indu published later on. What's this trajectory of pastoralism that I'm talking about? In her first book, Encounters, the westerly trade of Harappan civilization, pastoralists are present. They are mapped onto the landscape. And agriculturalists and pastoralists occupy distinct zones, the drier tracts and the wet valleys. The wet valleys were cultivated and agriculturalists were there, and in the drier tracts they were the pastoralists. There was connection between them, but this connection is not really adequately explored. It is not explored because her interest is on trade, and I'll come back to that later. Beyond mapping this presence of pastoralists and agriculturalists, she does not really explore the full logic of pastoralism. The practices of pastoralists, the rhythms and temporalities of their movements, why do they move from one region to another, and what is the pattern of that movement? What are the strategies of the movement? Why do they change the rhythms? What defines the rhythms of the movement? These are not explored in the first book at all. The strategies of herding, about herding size, all these things are explored subsequently, but not in her first book. The first book raised questions about the significance of pastoralism, I would argue, which are then developed much more in the essay that she writes, the wonderful essay that she writes on pastoralism in the prehistory of Balochistan in 1987. That, I think, is a founding essay which defines the way her ideas on pastoralism develops through the 90s and subsequently. And in this essay, she immerses you see her immersion in anthropological studies. In the earlier book, anthropology is used, but she's still working on trade and markets and commodities, which uses anthropology, but this argument now on tribal culture and pastoralism is entirely premised upon a deep reading on anthropology and ethnography of the time. Now in this essay, she begins to talk about herd size, rhythms of production, temporalities of movements, and the social networks that pastoralists develop through their movement. How the link between agriculturalists and cultivators is established through the movement of the pastoralist and others from one region to another, and reciprocal complementary relationship are established, which sustains not only agriculture and pastoralism, but social life itself. And this is an argument which she develops further in the 90s. But she was not interested in only developing her own arguments. She wanted to create a field of study, and that was pastoralism and the study of pastoralism, agriculture, and tribalism. And she organizes, and Dandekar refers to that already, she organizes a conference in 91 on pastoralism, which she subsequently calls very fondly as Pastoralism 1, in which her students, Ajay, Shupriya, and many others participate, and those are published in Studies in History, which we were publishing in 1991. And a whole range of ideas are raised in this on pastoralism, and a lot of ethnographers and anthropologists participate in it. So there is a dialogue between historians, archaeologists, and ethnographers. And there is a second edition of this in 2001. She publishes another volume, another workshop is held, and another volume which is on marginals and marginal society. In that, the arguments are developed even further. Things which could not be fully addressed in 91 was much more adequately and deeply addressed in the 2002 book. And this argument, the arguments in these, if you look over a period of time from her early writings to now, clearly show how the ideas on pastoralism really matures. In the first volume, the early arguments in the first volume she publishes, pastoralism and agriculture are seen as two distinct forms of subsistence, independent and in discrete zones. But subsequently, she looks at the intimate connection between the two within a mixed economy, to the extent that it is difficult to talk about pastoralist and agriculturalist and cultivator as distinct categories or distinct individuals, because the pastoralist is also taking to agriculture, and the people who you think are cultivators and agriculturalists are forced within a particular situation to become pastoralists. So there is a fluid movement between pastoralism and agriculture, which creates the social life of people in the zones where this mixed economy and this fluid relationship exists. And this is an extremely important argument which she develops over time, and I'll try and suggest that this is something which deepens her idea on Harappan culture and Mesopotamian, her insights into that. And this argument about flexibility, so the key words are now adaptability, flexibility, mobility, and how these things define the social life of a particular place in a pastoral, seemingly pastoral agricultural zone where they interact. And this leads to a profound question which she never answers, and I don't think we have answered it as yet very adequately. That is, if pastoralists and agriculturalists and cultivators are so fluid and so fixed, and if they are changing their occupation all the time, then what is their, how do you define them? What is their self-identity? Are they pastoralists? Are they cultivators? Are they agriculturalists? How do they see themselves, and how does society see them? Now, this is a question she poses, but she doesn't fully answer, nor do we as yet have an answer for arguments like this, because this can be only answered through ethnography and oral history, where we actually try and see how they see themselves. But this argument, why is it that I'm talking about the relationship between these ideas on pastoralism, tribal society, and her arguments on Harappan civilization? I think you see a shift between her first book and the Tulika book on understanding Harappa. In the first book, which is on trade, what she's looking at are commodities of trade, are strategies of trade, are the organizations necessary for trade. Here, pastoralism is not being developed, as I said, but nor is society being adequately explored as a social formation. Whereas by the time she writes Understanding Harappa, she's not just talking about trade. Trade remains very important. Trade is what defines the coherence of the trade, leads to social relationships and social networks, exchanges, etc. But what she is really talking about here is the way a coherent social formation develops, where you have artisans, workers, traders, pastoralists, cultivators, everyone not only existing, their life becoming important in the understanding of that social formation. Now, this is a deeper level of argument and a shift from her encounter book, in which we are introduced to the world of trade and commodities. She loved talking about lapis lazuli and other gems of the time. Now, this is why I think it's important to think of the way her different kinds of researches connect together in order to helping her to rethink her own ideas over time. And that's where I think, that is how I think we need to see a critical intellectual who is constantly rethinking his or her ideas, always aware of the limits of one's argument and always ready to critique not only Marshall and somebody else, but to critique himself. So Shereen's writing, I think, is an example of careful and cautious reasoning, presented with amazing clarity, something which everyone has talked about. She was deeply interested in theory, but disliked theoretical facts. She was ambitious in her conclusions, but careful about arguing within the limits of her own evidence, and always pointing to those limits. In her own writing, she was frequently talking about probable, possible, perhaps, maybe, could have. These are qualifying statements. It is not assertive arguments. Her arguments are at one level firm, assertive, and reflects a conviction. But if they are not warranted by the evidence, then she's all the time qualifying herself. And in fact, in some of her arguments, you find her arguing a point very powerfully, strongly, vehemently, and then ending with a critique of her own argument and keeping it open for the reader to decide whether her argument is persuasive or the critique itself is persuasive. Now, I think this is not modesty. This is not a lack of conviction. This is the sign of a self-confident, reflexive scholar who is at the height of her power. I'll stop.